And we're back with the latest update. A few things that we've gotten done in the last 5 days. Been very productive. First, we glued these rudder and vertical tail fairings in place. They're fiberglass strips. We had to clean them up a little bit, cut slots in them so you can get the access bolts in 3 points. And then we had to trim the actual ribs in the vertical stabilizer so that this was a nice clean faired in profile. We sanded those down a little bit too much. There's going to be some body fill work to clean that up, but looks great. Wasn't too difficult. Got those bonded and glued in place. A thing I wish I did different, this long vertical tail section, I cut into 2 pieces because it has to fit over this rudder stop. I wish I would have just cut a slot in here so this was together, because it was kind of challenging to get these to line up perfectly. I was able to clamp all of this whole section and hold it in place, including this bottom section, with masking tape, the green masking tape. Worked really well. But we've done some finish sanding, and all in all, very happy with the way this Speedster Tail finally looks. This rudder is almost ready to cover. The last things that we're waiting on are these foam blocks on the top. We've glued these in place because we've found that trying to shape them without them being glued in place is very challenging. So we glued them down. We're going to shape them and get a nice streamlined profile here, and then cover them in Hysol, and the rudder will actually be ready to cover. I haven't decided whether or not I'm going to put the tail light on before I cover it or after. It seems like it might be easier when it is covered. It might be hard to cover it with the tail light on, but maybe I'll ask that question on the forum. So in order to dispense the glue, we have been using plastic Ziploc bags and dispensing it like icing. It's like putting icing on a cake. That works really well. Kitfox only includes 2 syringes, so your options are either use the 2 syringes and throw them away, or spend a lot of time in solvent cleaning these syringes out, which I think is not ideal. You're cleaning a lot of excess epoxy. You also have to mix into a little cup. You have to mix all your Hysol in a cup. In fact, this one is decommissioned. This is our storage cup. Mix it in a cup and then put it into the syringe, which is a whole extra step. So what we've been doing is we put both parts into a plastic Ziploc. We mix it into the plastic Ziploc, then roll it like a pizza so that all the Hysol gets down to the bottom of the bag, and then cut a little slit and put it out like icing a cake. Works super well, and plastic bags are easy to come by, super cheap, and it's been an effective method which we are expecting to continue doing throughout the rest of this build. I do have one more syringe. I might use it for some stuff on the wings, but it honestly does not have a huge advantage over the plastic bag method. The next step that we did to the tail is to get these aluminum angles in. We had to shape them and sort of cut slots in the back so that they could be bent around this rib. And we back drilled through the holes with an angle drill and got these riveted and glued into place, along with this front bulkhead piece, which is glued and riveted in place and has been also varnished since. A note on this, and I will pull this out. Everybody should have an angle drill. This is an attachment that goes on the end of a drill bit. You can actually also get an angle drill that you could use, but this makes life 100 times easier. And it's definitely an essential tool in this build. I've used it on lots of parts of this kit, but what this allowed us to do was drill in from the bottom of these without either having the really long bit or using an angle or whatever technique you would normally do. In fact, the factory recommends trying to drill these in from the top, but it just doesn't work out. In fact, their method we decided wouldn't work, so we resorted to our superior option, the angle drill. You can see here, got these angles in place, nicely riveted, including the front bulkhead, which had to be trimmed pretty substantially, and then these last little tabs here, and this is on both sides. So there will be an inspection plate that goes over this whole assembly, because the horizontal stabilizer slides through here, and that aluminum sheet or the inspection plate allows the elevator to actually fly. Not the elevator, I keep saying elevator. It's the horizontal stabilizer is actually a trimmable horizontal stabilizer, so it's allowed to basically move up and down in this whole section. We haven't installed that yet because we're still waiting on eyelets. Again, frustrating eyelets, but this is finished and ready to, basically the tail end's almost ready to cover. Here you can see our foam blocks that were glued in place. We're actually going to need a little more up in here, but this one has been initially shaped, but we're going to take some sandpaper. This stuff shapes really easily. In fact, it's really soft. Most people use balsa wood. This is what's supplied with the kit, but we're going to come in and shape this down so that it's a perfectly smooth and straight profile, and then we'll coat it with epoxy. We'll coat it with epoxy resin or Hysol, and then use body fill to touch it up at the end, so it'll be perfectly smooth right across the top. You can see that this one's been partly finished on the top. I shaped the foam block down and then coated it with Hysol, so it's really strong, it's sturdy, way stronger than the foam would be originally. And then we'll have to come through and sand this down so it's smooth, and then use body fill to touch it up. This block on the bottom has been glued in place and it needs to be shaped down. We originally tried to shape these without gluing them. Wouldn't recommend doing that because it shifts all over the place and it's hard to hold in place. So after doing two relatively unsuccessfully, we ended up going with the glue in place and then shape method. So this is still on the docket. These are still functional. They're just going to require a lot more finish work to get them to be shaped to the way that we like them. While we're over here, I did finish gluing in these the actual elevator ribs in. These rib stiffeners we put in first. We laid it down on a table. I can put up a time lapse of that. This center console in. It was a pretty straightforward install. All of it's mostly done for you. It's not perfectly symmetrical, so you kind of have to wiggle it and snap it in place, but we got it clamped in place and then back drilled it with the really long 12-inch number 40 bit, so you could actually get way down underneath the fuselage and drill through. Then we got it bolted in place. One thought about that, the factory says that you shouldn't use the nylock nuts over and over again because you'll wear them out, but they don't supply you with check nuts or a replacement, so I went and bought some today. But you should definitely have those because this piece has to come in and out like 5 times, maybe even more, as many times as you need to work on this. And if you were using the nylock nuts, you would definitely wear it out. I would get some check nuts from the hardware store, pretty cheap, so that you can lock this stuff in place because it needs to be locked in place to line these flat notches in. This was the prefab kit, which the actual notch holes were fabricated on a CNC machine in the factory. Totally worth it. Would definitely recommend doing it. It's way better than I would have done it myself. All you have to do is drill them in and rivet them in place. This required a countersunk hole so that the rivet is flush mounted, but I don't have a 100-degree countersink, and they don't have that in the builder's tool list, so I ended up using a really flat angled drill bit that was big to do these countersink holes, which is another recommended method from the factory, but you should have a 100-degree countersink in your toolkit if you're building this yourself. So it's on the list that I put in there. But drilled these rivets holes and got these actually glued in place. So there's Hysol on the backside of the aluminum parts so that they're not only riveted, but they're also glued. And this will get upholstered in the final step. But it's, you know, functional and in place, and I'm really happy with, you know, how just sturdy and solid this whole center compartment is. Wow, rudder pedals. I don't even know where to start. This was probably the most frustrating part of this entire kit. Let's start with the first thing you have to do. These two pedals come independently powder coated. You have to slide one on top of the other. This won't fit over this one because it's been powder coated. So you have to sand all the powder coat off where these bearings ride. So you basically have raw steel tubing underneath these bearings on both sides, and you have to do it on both. So that took probably 4 hours of sanding total just to get these guys to slide. So we actually got them really smooth. The next step is to, once you rivet these guys on, actually put the pedals in place. And talk about bad hardware. These pedals, first of all, the bolts that run all the way through these pedals were not straight. Second of all, the nylock bearings inside of there, the holes inside of the nylock bearings were also drilled differently from each side. So that seized. Also, the outer diameter of the nylock bearing was too big, along with the outer diameter of these nylock bearings in the bottom. So I ended up trying to sand these because I was like, oh, I just sand it down pretty quickly. There was actually some corrosion inside of this tube where the powder coat got missed, which they warned about. That was just a bad powder coat job. Not the end of the world. But once I got the powder coat off, I was like, oh, it should fit. So I spent maybe 4 hours sanding and getting powder coat off, only to find that as soon as I slid those crooked bolts in with the crooked holes, the whole thing seized up. So I just said, done, I'm done with it. I'm taking it to the machine shop. Took it to the machinist. Wow, he is so good. And I recommend anybody who's building this, do not waste your time with these. Just take them to the machine shop in the first place. He straightened my bolts for me, redid the inner diameter of the hole, redid the outer diameter hole, custom fit these bushings on the end, and he did it in 2 hours. And it is perfect, flawless. There's still a tiny bit of resistance, but that's unavoidable. And not only that, I wasn't super frustrated when it was done. I feel like I go to the therapist every time I bring hardware to the machinist because I know when I come back, he's gonna solve all those problems. So if you're gonna build one of these yourself, just expect either to learn how to run a metal lathe yourself and become an expert machinist, or find a machine shop in town that will be willing to support you on stuff like this, because man, was this frustrating. So once we got all that done, we're super excited. Oh, all the parts fit and everything. So we actually went to go put it into the frame. Well, this usually sits on top of the floorboards, and we had the floorboards in as the manual instructed. And when I went to go drill this hole, I couldn't see these mounting, where these drill plates in the fuselage from the top. So when I drilled this back one, it was off by maybe ½ an inch, which put me right at the edge of the plate. And because of that, I couldn't get a nut on the bottom. So I had to fill that hole with structural adhesive and then re-drill it so that I could center this whole thing on. And I re-drilled everything without the floorboards. If you have the floorboards in when you're doing this, you might miss these middle plates. And that's way not good because you're drilling into the fuselage and you have to go refill that hole and seal it and everything. So do it with the floorboards out. To get these guys to keep from seizing these bearings that they rotate on, I had to sort of fiddle around with this middle guy so that they're perfectly parallel. They should be in a straight line. If they're off, they'll seize on these bearings. The outer mounting tabs, are drilled or welded lower into the fuselage than the middle one. So we actually had to shim these outer ones to keep this stuff from seizing. And we spent, another couple hours just fiddling with the shims to try and get it to be the least amount of resistance. Now these are rudders, so resistance of all the flight controls, this one would be the least noticeable, but still took a lot of time to get these right. Very frustrating. Another one of those hardware complaints that I think is pretty unacceptable. I mean, they talk in the manual about how they use A and N hardware, that you shouldn't substitute it with low-grade hardware. Well, I don't care how strong it is. If you send me a crooked bolt that's basically got a U in it that I've got to straighten, I don't know how to do that. And your average person could sit there and fiddle with it and get it right. Or you could just send good bolts in the first place. So my biggest complaint about this has been the hardware, particularly in the flight controls. Just, they don't compensate for powder coat, and a lot of it needs a lot of work. And I get it. Some people really like working on those things, and they have a lot of passion in sanding these things down to size and getting everything to fit smoothly, and they feel really good about it. But I care more about flying this thing than I do about sanding. And I also want it to be done professionally, and I want it to be like really smooth and well done. And in order to accomplish that, I need to use the right tool for the job, which in this case is basically a machine shop. Doing this with a jerry-rigged lathe, which is a drill and sandpaper, doesn't cut it for me. And quite frankly, I wish that they sent better hardware or had told me ahead of time, hey, you might need to work on some of this hardware. So I expected it, but it's sort of advertised as a kit that you can just sort of put together. And so far, some things you can't really do at home. I mean, you can, but you're gonna take many, many, many days of work and an incredible amount of patience, and it's not gonna come out even as well as if you just took it to the machine shop. So all that aside, we actually got this run, and these rudders are in. I got them tested. I hooked them up at the back. Really exciting. This is the first flight control that's actually like functional, because I don't have to wait for eyelets on this one. So rudder pedals are in. We're waiting to put these brake master cylinders, and then these will be good. As you can see, I have both the adjustable rudder pedal option, which I totally recommend. There's a huge amount of articulation here. And then we have the dual rudder and brake kit. So both pilot and co-pilot will be able to use the rudders and brake. So two of the options that I picked that, I don't know, I think they're gonna work out pretty well. The adjustable rudder pedals in particular are a must. It shouldn't even be an option. They should just include it. So that's that. We did get the rudder cables actually mounted up. You can see the eyelet here that we had to make. We had to swage that onto the cable. It's got shrink wrap over it to keep the cable from fraying. And then this is the adjustable rudder pedal option. So it's a little different than the standard option, which again, I would recommend the adjustable rudder pedals. This runs back through the first plastic tubes. It then goes through these pulleys here, which we had to install. And I thought about these pulleys. These cotter pins took 30 minutes to install. It goes back to one of my theories early on from the kit, which is if you see a hole, ream it. The powder coat filled this and made it really hard to get these through, not to mention the angle was really tough. So just one of the little things that eats up your day, trying to sneak a cotter pin in. You think, oh, that'll be less than 5 minutes. All I have to do is slide cotter pins in. Nope. Gotta take a file and open that hole up to get these little guys in. Anyway, cables run through these pulleys. The cables run through all of these little tubes. Then the cables connect back at these aft points, and you actually have to swage them or attach them together with little, I think it's called a nylock. No, it's not called a nylock. These little metal crimping pieces that you have to crimp together. And you can see this is the connection point from the pilot and co-pilot rudder pedals. So this is where they actually both attach to the tail. We attach that little metal bushing, then put heat shrink over them to keep the cables from fraying. And it's pretty clean, and none of these are gonna rub. So this adds redundant rudder pedal control without actually having a physical control link up in the front. It's just connected through the actual rudder cables. The rudder cables then come out all the way to the back of the fuselage and will attach the rudder to these upper eyelets here on the actual rudder tabs. We aren't supposed to connect this until after the whole fuselage is covered, according to the manual. So for now, we just have the heat shrink on there, which holds the cables from fraying. We actually have some pretty nice edges on there. And then once it's covered, we'll get this attached with little eyelets that'll attach to the rudder, and we'll get it rigged up. I did try it. I set up in the front and got the cables temporarily attached, and all the controls work. It's pretty cool to actually have a functioning flight control that I can sit in the cockpit and test check. Still waiting on those eyelets, so I can't do any of the other flight controls, but this is at least one that we can get started on, and maybe it's pretty much checked off the list until covering. So I'm super happy with that. A trick for cutting these cables, I actually tried a number of methods. They recommend using a cable cutter, which is this big hammer that has a chisel on it, basically. It's more like an anvil, and it chops a really smooth end off of it just using the hammer force. We don't have one of those, and we tried using dikes, shears, really big scissors, bolt cutters, all unsuccessfully. The best method was using a Dremel tool with a fiberglass disc blade on it that cuts pretty smoothly on the edge as long as it's wrapped in masking tape. The reason why we use masking tape and not heat shrink is because if you get the heat shrink hot, once it's already shrunk, it'll crack. So you wrap it in masking tape, cut it right in the middle of the masking tape slowly, not letting it get too hot. And then once it's done, carefully peel the masking tape off, slide the heat shrink tubing back on and heat it on, and then you get these really nice ends. And that's true for all the eyelets. The first one wasn't the best, but by the time the fourth one came in, it was professional. So I feel like I'm an expert cable cutter and swager, which is definitely going on the resume. And that's it for actually the rudder controls. We won't really address this much again until we get the brakes and the fabric on the plane. These are basically one of my blue tape slips in the manual. Every time I get to a point where I've completed everything until fabric covering, I put a little blue piece of masking tape to mark where I left off, and then I date the last line that I completed in the instructions. So I'm getting a lot of blue masking tape tabs that makes me feel good. So the manual's full of blue masking tape tabs, basically indicating that we've completed steps to the best of our ability given the stage of the airplane. So eventually those blue masking tape tabs will all come out once we A, get all of our parts in, and B, get this thing covered and rigged and finished. So progress is coming along pretty well, much faster than I expected now that I'm not fiddling around with correcting hardware. Whenever I get to those issues, I just let go of my hardware issues and give them to the machinist, who then solves the problems for me. So without those tedious sanding and basically home lathe jobs to deal with, things happen to move a lot more quickly. But everything does take a lot longer than you'd expect, just because there's powder coat to remove, there's finish sanding to do, there's little touch sanding to do, like these little tabs for the trim actuator needed to be filed down to be fit. So in the manual, it may seem like it's straightforward that you just bolt something together, but you go to do it, and it really doesn't work out that simply. Just this bulkhead here wasn't really the right size. I get it, you have to do finish work, but in the manual it just says, place it in, cut it to fit. Well, if you placed it in and thought, oh, I just need to cut it to fit, you would have been wrong by about probably 2 hours. So everything takes a little bit longer than you'd expect, and we're starting to get used to that. We're also getting better at using our tools more efficiently and using time more efficiently, and also keeping calm and cool when we encounter a piece that isn't perfect out of the box. That's kind of the expectation at this point. So we're not as sort of taken back by these extra steps that seem excessive. So in general, the attitude is a lot better. It's much more jovial. when we encounter these frustrating tasks, either A, the machinist solves it for us, or B, we have a laugh and finish the job. So it's not all bad. I'm actually enjoying the building process. There's some challenges that you're faced with and a lot of skills that I'm learning. Cable swaging, techniques, things like that. I would say the majority of the sentiment is positive. Okay, I know what you're thinking. This is starting to look like a real aircraft. We have even mounted our mock-up instrument panel, VFR only, obviously. This seat install was one of the most rewarding tasks of this build process so far, simply because I can sit in it now and pretend like I'm actually flying the plane, which is so childish, but it's a little piece of joy that I get to feel. That's kind of hard to explain, but you know, it's this skeleton bone monster and burden that you look at seeing, oh, I'm never going to get this finished. This is going to take a lot longer than I expected. And then you get something like this in and it brings back the inspiration as to why I'm excited about having this thing done. So got this in, was a little bit of finish work. Fiberglass from the start is not usually that precise. It's a fabric laying process. I've actually worked kind of with it when I made surfboards, but it's hard to get these curves and edges to be exact. Now they can technically make better molds and whatnot, but from the factory this has a little bit of a wonky shape to it, just like those fiberglass tail fairings. So I ended up laying masking tape along the edges of the top and the bottom tabs, and I cut a perfectly straight line to trim off excess material. And then we had to shape, you know, these slots for the control sticks, which I should have done with the floorboards in so that I matched those profiles. I actually don't know what they look like yet, but they definitely fit the stick at the moment, and it's all going to get covered with carpeting and upholstery, so it's not even going to get seen anyway. It's aesthetic. A few other notes about this. The bolt holes should be aligned with weight in the seat. So you actually should get in here and sit in it or clamp it down and put weight in, because the bolt holes aren't supposed to support the weight. They're not really structural. The weight is supposed to sit on the actual edge of the fiberglass and on these, basically these metal spars that come through on the fuselage. So I actually had to enlarge this one slightly so that the weight wasn't sitting on the bolt. If I had known from the start to put weight on it and that it would, the word they use in the manual is that it saddles the frame. If I would have known that it would have flexed to fully saddle the frame, I would have waited to drill the holes. But it's not a structural issue by any means. It was just one of those sort of, oh darn, why did I do it that way? I wish I would have known differently. Another thing we had to do was cut the seatbelt slots, and that's an aesthetic thing, but they have to be, you know, sighted to the right location. And I ended up mounting mine a little lower than the manual recommended because I want them closer to the actual seatbelt plates so that they're not putting as much side load on the fiberglass seat. But this guy was one of the most exciting parts, as silly as it seems, actually getting a seat in here and sitting in this cockpit. It still puts a smile on my face. So basically, I'm about to go fly this thing. That's what it feels like. I can, you know, hold on to the control stick and fire the missiles and do all the things that I'm gonna do, but in my mind. So just really glad to have this guy in here, and it's gonna be ready to be upholstered. But that's way down the line. That's finish work, and we've got a lot to get done before then. I did test fit the seat belts. I'm not going to put those in until the very end because they're just so easy to bolt on, and I don't want them to get damaged while we're building. But I did rig those up, and it's a 4-point harness. It runs through here really nicely, and there is a pilot and co-pilot side. It's based on the direction of the buckle. So you got to make sure you get that right. I have them in a box sorted up there, but got those seat belts in and then pulled them out because I feel like that's kind of like upholstery. It's one of those finished jobs that we got to wait till the end to get right. That is our latest update. Thanks for watching. Look forward to doing it again soon.